Well, is it in fact the case that shareholders have the right incentives? Why don't corporations let shareholders run the company? Kenneth Arrow distinguishes between two modes of corporate decision-making, or decision-making in any organization. One is consensus, and the other is authority. Consensus is basically the kumbaya model of governance. Sit around and have everybody talk it out and reach a decision, like in a partnership. One person, one vote, hash it out, reach a result. Authority is have a central decision-making body to whom you funnel all the information and let them make decisions that are binding on the group as a whole. And Arrow said, look, you end up with authority decision-making models or structures where three conditions are present. First, your constituents have differing interests. Second, they have differing access to information. And third, there are collective action problems. Obviously, shareholder voting presents serious collective action problems. We can't get them all in one room. We're going to have to do it by proxy, which means there's limited ability to have discussion or any sort of deliberative process. Obviously, there are serious information asymmetries. Lots of investors have relatively little information, relatively little time to gather information, certainly less information than, say, a board of directors. And certainly shareholders can have different interests. My mom's 88 years old. She's an investor, an avid investor. But as she puts it, at her age, she doesn't even buy green bananas anymore. Her investment time horizon's kind of different than mine is. And we have competing interests with respect to how we would want firms to invest. So all three of Arrow's requirements for authoritative decision are present in the large corporation. And so we vest decision-making authority in a board of directors. Now, of course, that creates the principal agent problem. But I put it to you that most law professors have been too concerned with the principal agent problem because, you see, we can solve the principal agent problem by eliminating discretion. We could solve the principal agent problem by turning everything over to the shareholders. That we do not do so suggests that a central decision maker with the power of fiat has advantages, and that decision making by shareholders would have significant disadvantages. Well, what might those disadvantages be? Many shareholders recognize that they are better off pursuing a policy of rational apathy rather than an activist agenda. They know that directors have better information and incentives than do they as shareholders. The law students in the room, most of you are probably third years. If you're taking this class, it's presumably because you plan on being a corporate lawyer. Either that or you're a public interest law student here on a mission of sabotage and subterfuge. But I assume most of you plan on going out and working on Wall Street. Well, the good news is you're going to get up there on Wall Street and you're going to be making a ton of money. I read the website abovethelaw.com all the time, and they're just staggering amounts. We have an associate compensation crisis in this country, by gosh. Actually, there was some whining on one of the abovethelaw.com's posts recently from partners that they weren't able to pass on the increased associate salaries to their clients. You're going to be making a ton of money. The bad news is you're going to be working a ton of hours. You're going to be billing, 2,500 hours a year, and you're going to have no social life, and you're going to have no life outside of the office. And 1988, young associate, was a leap year just like this year. 29 days, I billed 310 hours in 29 days. You're not going to have time to be an informed investor. The last thing you're going to want to do when you get home at night is to open the Wall Street Journal to read up on making an informed decision. And heavens knows the last thing you're going to want to do is pick up a 100-page proxy statement and wade through it to make an informed decision on voting. My favorite story in this regard is a story that was in the Wall Street Journal back in the early 90s. And they asked, I think it was Kathleen McGrath, who was then the head of the SEC's market reg or corporate finance division. And they were complaining about the length of proxy statements. Well, proxy statements have gotten a lot longer since then. But they said, Ms. McGrath, when you get a proxy statement in the mail, what do you do with it? And she got kind of sheepish. And she said, well, I usually throw it on the stack of stuff to do when I get time to it. And then about 3 months later, I recycle it. That's the SEC person that runs the system saying that. Who is likely to be active? Well, we know who's likely to be active. The activist investors are primarily unions and public sector pension funds. And that's a problem, it seems to me. The interests of unions as investors differ radically from those of ordinary investors. The pension fund of the union representing Safeway's workers, for example, tried to oust the Safeway directors who stood up to the union in collective bargaining negotiations. Union pension funds have used shareholder proposals to obtain employee benefits that they couldn't get through bargaining, although the SEC does a fairly good job of policing that. AFSCME's involvement is especially worrisome. The public sector employee union is highly politicized and has used its pension funds as a vehicle for advancing political and social goals unrelated to the interests of shareholders generally. And if I'm right that what we have here is not an executive compensation crisis, but rather a problem of wealth inequality, of income disparity, the fact that it is basically left liberal associated pension funds that are engaged in this sort of activism is, I think, quite telling. It is part of a broader problem of class warfare. So the case for vesting authority in the board, I think, becomes even stronger once you realize the relative demerits of shareholders. Whatever flaws board governance may have, they pale in comparison to the information asymmetries and collective action problems that lead most shareholders to be rationally apathetic. In conclusion, I think legislation that fixes a non-existent problem by upsetting basic principles of federalism ought to be a non-starter. Legislation that fixes a non-existent problem by contributing to a fundamental shift in the locus of corporate decision-making authority ought to be a non-starter. But unfortunately, the executive compensation debate has gotten so thoroughly bollocksed up with issues of financial populism that all too often rational arguments have fallen on deaf ears. Thank you very much.